Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed. Welcome to the Troubadour podcast. Today we will be going over the poem The Lamb by William Blake in his Songs of Innocence and Experience. And in this poem today, we're going to see the most innocent of all the innocent poems in the Songs of Innocence. And we'll see really what he means. I think it'll give coloring to a lot of the other poems, or all the other poems in the Songs of Innocence, including the ones we've already covered, the Piper, or the introduction to the Songs of Innocence, and the Echoing Green, which you can go to troubadourmag.com. You can find up at the top YouTube links, Facebook links, podcast links. I'm on Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher, and everywhere you can listen to podcasts. So, all this content is free. Go ahead and find it, search it. And the only thing I ask, is I really hope if you like it at all, share it, like it, comment something, because I'm not asking for any money. That's the stuff that really helps out. Now, and like whatever channel you prefer or whatever. Anyway, so with this poem, like we've been talking about with some of the other ones, if you want to see my former videos on Blake, it's a really cute one to give to a child. And in fact, it is very much like, it is a child narrator. It's in the voice of a child, as you'll hear in a second. And a child will get something very simplistic and pleasant from the rhyme scheme. And it has even a refrain, which I'll, point out so you know what a refrain is in poetry. And it's done as an apostrophe, by the way, which I want to have a little poetry term. If you are a teacher, maybe this will help. An apostrophe in poetry is just a figure of speech in which the poet or speaker addresses an absent person, abstract idea, or a thing. In this case, a child addressing an inanimate, an animal. In this case, a lamb. Now, I'm actually going to read the Lamb, and then I'm going to read, after we discuss it, I'm going to read another poem from the Songs of Experience, but I won't tell that to you until later. But I wanted you to know I'm going to read both of them, because if you remember, or if you haven't seen this, the Songs of Innocence and Experience, the subtitle is Showing the Contrary States of the Human Soul. So he believes that there's two fundamental states of the human soul, innocence and experience. But they are kind of conjoined together. They're combined, and they're always within you. So there's a little bit of the experience that is seated or already there in the child. That's, also, in whatever is innocent, and, that you get in the experience moments, or the mature, usually we think of it. But before I read those poems, I've been giving some introductions about Blake, reading to kids, particularly. These are great poems for kids. And then I'm also, but in this episode, I want to give a quick little idea about Blake as a Christian. Now, Blake was the most Christian of all the great romantics, the English romantics, the big six, as they're called: Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, Byron. There's two generations. The first generation, Blake being the oldest, born in 1757. Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, the first generation. Byron, Shelley, Keats, the second generation. Now, we're going to talk about the second generation more later, but now, of all of them, Wordsworth became more Christian as he got older. At least people claimed about him. He said it was always the same. He didn't fundamentally change, but he definitely did have. He had ecclesiastic poems later in his life that he did not have earlier, and he did not create early in his life. So I think there was a change in Wordsworth, whether he admits it or not. Blake was always very Christian, but I think, like all the romantics, has a big problem with the dogmatic religious church, the actual stone structures with the commandments and telling people what to do and where to stand and where to sit and how to talk and how to act and how to make love. And that's actually a big issue for Blake. All these things are big issues for Blake and for all the romantics. And one of the things that is going on in this era that I think is really important to grasp in the era that I think even is important for us today, it's something that I believe resonates with us to this day, is that the church was waning, 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 fading, going away. Now it was still very powerful, but for the first time in 1,000+ years, it was on the downside. There was an uptick in science, and the beliefs and the views of science could understand and figure out anything. Oh, we don't understand it? Okay, we just don't understand it right now, but science will figure it out. Right. And we now know there's a tactic that the religionists use called the God of the gaps. Whenever science can't answer something, God is there. But, today this gap is closing and closing. But whenever there's anything that we cannot figure out, it's like free will, I think, is an example of this. The scientists don't have a really good answer. They just say, some of them say we just don't have it. And so the religionists jump in there in that gap and they say, free will we got that, right? That's from God, right? And that's like, you see that all the time. Whenever there's some kind of unexplained phenomenon, God, right? That's the God of the gaps between reason and faith, fundamentally. Well, this is for the first time beginning to close, and people are starting to see, oh, wait, the heavens are the same as earth? That was a huge shift in thinking. Since the ancients, humanity thought the heavens were made of a fundamentally different stuff than the earth. But with, the great, Galileo and the Newtons proving that the heavens and the earth were all made of the same laws. So they all were governed by the same laws. That then made people start to think, well, maybe there isn't a God. Maybe it's just all us, right? And that for the first time, we start getting some reasoned arguments about this. Now, in its place during the Romantic Revolution, and I think this is what is so critical for us to understand, in the place of church, as it was waning, people still needed a kind of emotional, conscious, psychological, religious, or spiritual fuel. And where did they turn? Art. Art became this kind of religion. And in fact, you get, I have a couple of examples here for you of what was going on in this period of time. So just like you have a church house for religion to kind of, exalt in the power and the excellencies of His Majesty, the Lord God over all things. Well, now you need a kind of a new space for that. And one of the first ones is interesting in the arts, and that's the opera house. And I think music, from what I understand of the Romantic Revolution, music tended to be the kind of filling in that religious feeling. And that's why if you listen to music of this period, of the Romantic period, it feels, on a religious level. And I think the English Romantics also do this, and we'll get back to that in a second. So just as an example, the first official full-time freestanding opera house was created by Frederick II of Prussia. And he had a quote of why he reviled, by the way, Christianity. He reviled Christianity, Frederick II. And in this new opera house, it was dedicated by King Frederick to Apollo and the Muses. Right? So no reference to God, to Christian God. Like he said, forget all of that, go back to Apollo and the Muses. And he said, since my childhood, I have loved the arts, literature, and the sciences. And if I can contribute to their propagation, I dedicate myself with all the zeal of at my disposal, because there can be no true happiness in this world without them. And you see this over and over and over again, where the idea is that the source of happiness, the way through to happiness, is arts, literature, painting, music in particular, but poetry as well. Poetry, Wordsworth was considered a high priest of this era, and he often captured the soul of this. Now, this is one example. And what I'm trying to do right now is just give you an overview of the kind of feeling. And there is a Christian, or there is a religious desire that is part of humanity that Christianity had filled, but now is being filled by art. And here's the last example, then we're going to get back to Blake. Beethoven's funeral oration. And this is in the early 1800s. It was not given by a priest. It was written written by the leading poet Franz Grillparzer. I'm not familiar with him as a poet, but it was delivered by a leading actor, Henrik Anschutz. Did not mention the Christian God once. And the God mentioned is art. And I think this is very important. Here's a quote. "The thorns of life had wounded him deeply, and as the castaway clings to the shore, so did he seek refuge in the arms, O thou glorious sister and peer of the good and the true, thou balm of wounded hearts, heaven-born art." And this is what people revered. All the English romantics, the big six we were talking about. Now, the sole exception for the most part is, I think, Blake. Blake is the most Christian in the traditional sense. He's using the symbols of Christianity. He's relying on them heavily. But there's one, but of course, he's conflicted because he is a romantic and he also despises anything that stands in the way of the true kind of romantic, or the true self. He hates repression and oppression, any kind of it. So he does not want you to repress yourself, and he does not want other people to oppress others. And this is a big problem for him. But he is, you'll see in so much of his poems, a Christian, strong Christian, element of, peace, love, forgiveness, love thy brother, innocence, meekness, mildness. That those are good virtues for him, ultimate virtues. Whether you agree with that or not is irrelevant to understanding and appreciating the artistry and even the revelry that is in his artwork. And that's what I'm going to be showing you next. Okay, the Lamb. Now, before I read it, I wanted to show you, as I've been doing, the illustration that Blake is creating here. Now, remember, he does everything. He colors this all by himself, and he created all this himself. He drew it all himself and then had a special printing process. But it was like several dozen. This was not, hundreds or, 1,000 or 2,000 copies. It was very rare. So he's not popular in his own time. I think this is a big reason for it. Now, this is the illustration. You could see these vines, which are common for him in his poetry. And you can see, let's make sure I'm not blocking it. If you're on YouTube, Facebook, or, troubadourmag.com, you can see the image here. If you're listening on the podcast, that's great. You can go to the website when you get a chance and look at the images to help you with the poem. But you can see a little boy with, lambs. There's a whole bunch of lambs or sheep, and there's a particular lamb. Now, a lamb, of course, is the first year of a sheep's life as a lamb. It's a child. It's a baby. Just like the boy. We're going to talk about the relationship there. Now, in the picture, you can see he's kind of talking to this creature, this lamb. And it's, in here, it's like he's almost admonishing or exhorting. He's having a real conversation, and it looks like the boy in the picture is actually nude. It's a little child talking to a little lamb. And the fact that he's nude is important, I think. Like, it's not a coincidence. He's not clothed, and there's going to be a message about clothing, by the way. Okay, so let's, by the way, just so you can picture the cuteness and innocence of a lamb, because this is important for the understanding of the poem. Here's a lamb, a cute little lamb. And here's another one. So have a picture of a lamb in your mind. Like, the cuter, the better. The cuter the lamb, the better, because that's what we're going to be talking about in this poem, is the adorable nature of these lambs, or of a lamb, or really the innocence of them. And he's going to be, Blake is going to be stressing it. Now, as I've said a couple of times, we're going to do this in a very un-Blakean way, because he wants you to read his poem in the illustrated version, but I think it's a little harder to see the text. So, in the reproduction that I have, so I'm going to show you the text on a blank piece of white paper, which is not what he preferred. Okay, so I'm going to read this to you. It's 2 stanzas, very short. So you can see it right here if you're looking. but it's quite a short thing, but there's a lot going on, and we're going to talk about this. And keep in mind that this is good to read to kids. If you have kids or if you're a teacher, read it to them, have them write it down, have them read it, have them play with the words and ask them what they think is going on. Blake made the point, this is very important to him, that a child would get one understanding and they would be right. An adult would see something else and they would be right. And that's the point. Okay. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright? Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice? Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. Now, I'm sure you could see the Christian imagery here, but it's a very simple poem in its surface, but I think it's working on multiple levels of symbolism. And there's a lot that's going on with what he's trying to say in the totality of the Songs of Innocence and Experience, and in this particular poem. Now, I've made this argument before. I'm not going to go into it again. I've by reading the whole work of how an artist put it together, you're much more capable of understanding the art that they're trying to get across. So we have a tendency in our era to, if we read poems at all, it's one isolated poem completely disconnected from how the person wanted you to read it. Even the way you're reading it with me is not the way the Blake wanted you to read it. He wanted you to buy his handmade product and read it. Now, of course, sometimes, artists could be eccentric, and Blake was the most eccentric, so we can't do all of that. But just like with lyrical ballads with Wordsworth, if you followed me through that process, you get something so important when you read the totality of it, because these artists are not, when they're putting it together, it's not arbitrary. These great artists are doing it on purpose. They have a conscious effort. Just as an example, in Wordsworth, he has several poems that are just lines. It says lines written by a yew tree, under a yew tree, lines written by my house or by a stream. And then those are all related in a certain method and form and theme. And they help you understand lines, written on Revisiting the Banks of the Wye, Tintern Abbey, the Tintern Abbey poem that I've done recently, if you watch that one, which is one of his greatest poems of all time. And by reading the totality of that book and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, which there's a kind of a play on, I think, you get a better understanding of all the individual poems. That's true here. So by reading this and reading it in the Songs of Innocence, it helps you to understand the layers that are going on. But think about some of the ways you want to approach a poem. So one of the questions you want to ask is who is saying it, and in this case, to what? So we already know because we see a little boy talking to a lamb in that picture that I showed you, that illustration by Blake. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Thee is you. Now, by the way, thee is something that we've lost in our culture. We think of the word, if we said, little lamb, who made you? That's actually the formal version. Little lamb, who made thee is informal. It's how you approach and talk to children. So he's we've lost that today. We don't have that anymore. But at the time in 1789, when this was written or published, that was actually a way that you would, address informally to a child. Where are the mother and father, right? Something like that. That's not accurate, but that just came to mind. Okay. Dost thou know who made thee? Do you know who made thee? It's a lot of like you, but in different forms. And so there's an emphasis there. It says little boys, and you can actually imagine a little boy actually talking to a sheep. Dost thou know who made thee, gave thee life, and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? Mead is meadow, just a picture of grassy field. So this boy is asking this lamb, who made it? Who created the lamb? Right? Do you know? It's a kind of rhetorical, but not really. Like you can imagine again a child talking to a farm animal, especially a very small child might be petting, and this is kind of like a pet to him. And he's thinking about that in that way. So, who gave thee life and bid and, told you to feed and, by the stream and over the mead? Who's the one who put you here to do that, to go and walk around and eat, and gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright? You can imagine this child, petting this lamb and being delighted by the softness of its wool. And if you've ever been to a petting zoo with young children, they're like that. Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Vale is valley, just another way of saying valley. So he's asking, who gave you the tender voice? Now, of course, a lamb doesn't have a voice like a human does, but it makes a sound, a bleating sound. And it's a cute, whimsical, fun, enjoyable sound, right? Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Now, this could be sung. And that's a refrain from the beginning of the stanza to the end of the stanza, right? There's a little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee this, blah, 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 blah. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Okay. Now, in the second poem, second stanza, the little boy tells him. Now, there's something, I think, of artifice to this, because if this is a very young child, 4 years old maybe, we do get a little bit of, okay, so I can buy that a little child will talk to an animal, probably not in this exact wording, although these are all words that a young child will know, except for, even today. Except for mead, you'd have to tell a child that that's meadow, and vales, that's valley, but children would, and of the these and thous, you could just tell them that that's you. But they know what clothing of delight is. They know gave, they know softest, they know woolly, bright. They know those words. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Now, this is where it gets a little bit like, okay, there's artifice going on here. A boy, would he be able to have that kind of consciousness to tell what he's about to tell? But maybe. And I think, it's not completely outside the realm of possibility that a child would, speak. And so this is going to answer one of our questions about what's going on with this poem, another layer. Little lamb, I'll tell you who made you. He is called by your name. He is called a lamb, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child, I a child, and you a child. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. God bless thee. So we, of course, know that the lamb is Jesus. We should know this is how he's referred to in the Bible several times as, the Lamb of God. And there's several mentions of Jesus as a lamb. And it's a very interesting, if you know anything about Christianity, and I'm definitely not an expert, but even if you're not an expert, if you're just in the West, you probably have some basic, this has been in the ethos to some degree in the background, even if you're an atheist and even if your parents are atheist, that obviously there's something about sacrificial lamb. This comes from the Old Testament and the Jewish idea of a scapegoat, by the way. But this idea of the sacrificial lamb, right, is a big part of our culture. And Jesus is a sacrificial lamb. He is betrayed by the people who are supposed to, be on his side. He knows that this is going to happen. And he lets it happen. And then on his, while he's being crucified, he asks his father, who's supposed to be himself, but that's another question. But, God the Father, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. So he becomes, he's the Father, and the Trinity, the Holy Ghost, the Father, and the Son in Christianity are all one. But the interesting thing here is that God placed a flesh version of himself, or his son, whatever you want to say it, on earth. And so when the child in this poem says, for he calls himself a lamb, he is meek and he is mild, he became a little child. That's the reference to baby Jesus. And then the child at the end of this poem says, we are called by his name. So now we have a triple association of Jesus, the actual physical animal lamb that's in front of this boy, and the little boy. So we have those three figures that are playing here. And now if you know a little, here's where it becomes adult. A child will just see a little boy talking to a lamb, and it's cutesy. And, it's like a little fairy tale type story. We know what happens to Jesus. We know what a sacrificial lamb is. So the question is then, what kind of sacrificial lamb is going on with this child? Now, the question is not answered in this poem. It's in the totality of Songs of Innocence and Experience, but this is one of the themes that's going to play throughout this thing, is that we know there's just like with the echoing green, there was a darkness right there at the edges of the corner of the poem. It's not the stress. It's just like all of a sudden there's a darkness and there's a tinkling of it. And that's part of the life of this poem. And it's the same thing of that poem and this poem is, we know there's, something about innocence that doesn't last in this world. Jesus couldn't last. The lamb, might be made into lamb chops. And the boy is going to be turned into a man who's going to go to war and going to fight and going to die, right? Things like that. I mean, 1789 is the year of the storming of the Bastille. And that's, there's a lot to say about this. He wrote and published the Songs of Experience with the Songs of Innocence in 94, the year after the Reign of Terror and the war with Britain and France. So there's a lot of different things going on in the Songs of Experience that is kind of like, this is the loss of the innocence. But there you're going to find that there's even there a teeny bit of innocence, right? So it's kind of the contrary state because he thinks they're going together all the time. But here I hope you'll see that, there's this idea of Jesus as a sacrificial animal or sacrificial lamb. And there's this lamb who may be slaughtered, right? Or at least the wool will be cut off of it, very likely. And then there's this child. So if all these two other elements in the poem are sacrifice, we know as adults, what kind of sacrifice is this child going to go through? This innocent, cute, perfect little child. And that's the question, right? That's what the Songs of Innocence and Experience explores. Okay, now I want to read the poem from the Song of Experience that contrasts, that's the contrary state. Many of the poems in this series has a comparison poem. I think this is one of the stronger comparisons because on the one hand you have the lamb, on the other hand you have a tiger. Now I'm not going to go into a full analysis of this. I do want to read it and point one thing out, and I want you to think about it for yourself, or one or two things out, because I am going to do a poem just on this when I get to the Songs of Experience later. So let me read this. This is called The Tyger from the Songs of Experience by William Blake, published in 1794. Tyger, Tyger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist thy sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, and what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears? Did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tyger, Tyger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? Now you can hear that there's a tonal difference. It's quite a bit darker than the simplistic little lamb who made thee. Also notice the punctuation, that there is no punctuation in the child's voice when he says who asks a question, but there's a lot of question marks in this one. What do you think that means? When I get to Tyger, I may make a reference to that and tell you what I think it means. But again, just think about Songs of Innocence and experience, and what happens with experience sometimes. Now, in Tyger, Tyger, burning bright, the Tyger, we get a contrast between God made this innocent little lamb, and as an honest artist, William Blake, and a Christian, he was a Christian, but he was an honest artist as well. He could not escape, like many honest Christians, the real problem of evil. Why would a God, a benevolent, perfect, all-knowing God, create this absolutely innocent, look at this lamb, that, and also create that to murder it and eat it alive? That's the question that an honest religionist would ask. And there's no obvious answer, and there is an answer, but we're not going to stress it too much at the moment because I want to focus on the poem, the contrast between the lamb. When we get to the Tyger, we'll talk more about that, the problem of evil. But I want you to think about that for a minute, and that's kind of the contrast between the lamb. Is you have this lamb, but we also know that it's a sacrificial lamb, that Jesus died for us, and that this child, is going to have to die in some fashion as well. Maybe that's what it means to become an adult. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe there's just a harshness to the world. And in this poem, the Tyger, we get just like in the lamb, we have a theme of clothing it, right? So it's by who bid thee to feed, who gave you clothing. Remember, the little child is naked and he's not clothed. Now, I don't know if that means that he cannot be clothed, if he's too poor to be clothed. I think it's just that he's so innocent, he's like the naked animals around him, or not clothed with artifice, right? It's just his skin, just like the lamb is just whatever grows out of it. And he's asking, who gave you clothing of delight? Who gave you that woolly bright, gave thee such a tender voice? And the Tyger, we ask, who could frame, who could structure your fearful symmetry? The beauty, the symmetry and beauty of a Tyger, but we know that there's some kind of immortal, powerful hand that forged it in this poem, because he believes that. But why would it, like that's a terrible, horrible thing. And it's in terms of it being a murder machine. And it's hard for us, I think, even to grasp this, because you're probably not afraid of tigers unless you were in a forest. Like if you fell into a pit with a tiger, you'd be afraid of that tiger, right? But now we're so distanced from it, it's hard. We see like little videos of guys who put their heads in tigers that they've trained, and it's like, they're playing around and, oh, how cute is that tiger? Yeah, they're cute until they rip your face off, right? And in the jungle, they're vicious. And there's a documentary called Tigers and Men, the ultimate war, the ancient war, or something like that. And it's an interesting documentary. I'll try to link it up when I do the Tyger, about this war between men and this tiger, because tigers have been hunting. They're the animals who I think who've hunted us the most over this millennia. And in the poem The Tyger, we get that kind of the same thing of armoring it rather than clothing it. so we have this vision of this armor, like Hephaestus, the god, immortal armorer, in this distant deeps or sky, burnt the fire of your eyes. On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand, right? Like a Hephaestus, the god of the forge, dare seize the fire? Who dares to create such a murderous monster? What shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart, to make you viciously rip apart somebody? Now, of course, a tiger is just a tiger. This is the stand-in metaphorically for all evil. Why does evil exist? Not just evil by humans' free will, but also tigers, hurricanes, droughts, diseases. There's all kinds of things that the question is, why would you create a disease and the thing, that is innocent and did nothing wrong to be killed by it if there's a benevolent God in the sky? And so he's, as an artist, he's questioning and being honest about these questions. And that's kind of the beauty of the poem, I think, besides the fact that it's playing on this level on these multiple levels of innocence and experience, and how children and adults experience these poems. Okay, so that's it for The Lamb. I hope that was enjoyable and enlightening for you. I recommend that you go check it out check out the video if you haven't seen the pictures, or go to troubadourmag.com, and I'll post them in the blog post for The Lamb by William Blake. Thank you, and I will see you next time.